Hello. This is for the Ukrainians. First of all, I support your cause. I think Russia should have never invaded your country, and they bumbled it and stumbled it in the beginning, almost completely. And you demonstrated that you are capable of fighting back long before you had a penny of our help, of any help from outside, before a single bullet or artillery round was given to you or sold to you from the outside. So, to quote Game of Thrones, you showed you could pay the iron price, okay? So, I'm rather intrigued by something I saw on the internet, which is that, the Russian strategy, now that things are a little bit more stalematey, is to try to get the Ukrainians to disperse their troops by attacking them along many fronts instead of a concentrated attack. And one way that the Ukrainians have compensated is by setting up robot machine nests. Friggin' brilliant. Okay, there was one location somebody was reporting from inside the Ukraine and said that they actually took over a month, I think like 40 days, of constantly trying to assault this machine gun position and taking losses and being occupied and pinned down. And when they got there, it was an automated machine gun. So basically, they had set up a remote control and a camera, and they only were physically in the position to reload it. And they were in a farther away, safer position. So this is incredible. This actually changes land warfare because without the need of a heavily automated power suit like in Starship Troopers, and without a highly sophisticated or expensive robot using almost shopping mall security technology, you're able to pin down and occupy a much larger force. And because there's nobody in it and the position is really low, and a machine gun without a human shooter and a spotter and an A gunner can have an even lower profile and be even better protected. This actually changes land warfare, and I'm going to talk about the ways in which it can, and I'm going to talk about tactics that may be employed because they occur to me. I'm no general, but I do have infantry experience in the Marine Corps. I did go to infantry school, and I did go to security forces school, and I did go to a command called Fast Company, which was counterterrorism, but we also still did infantry training all the time, offensive and defensive, and I was in the National Guard as a 19 Delta, which is a cavalry scout, which uses some infantry tactics and cavalry tactics. So I do have some basis on which to comment on this. First of all, I think this could have actually been, if they had more time and resources, they could have made this a far deadlier thing. Say you have a machine gun or two machine gun positions, but spaced apart so they have interlocking fields of fire, right? And you can put it on high ground. Then what you can do is, if you have the coverage, maybe on a rainy day, a super foggy day, right? You can go out there and put out some pits and some punji sticks and maybe even a couple mines and barbed wire and fortify that position. That position, having been fortified, becomes an attractive target to the enemy. It tends to draw their fire and their attention, diverting them from other places. That alone has value, but the whole idea is you can, create casualties. For example, if you have landmines and they bring in a BRDM or a BMP, a reconnaissance vehicle, or even a tank, that can actually hurt the tank. And pits, and so someone can fall in a pit and get stuck with a punji stick or something. So that makes that position harder to assault, but the fun doesn't have to end, my Ukrainian brethren. I'm just thinking, well, if you set up a claymore facing the machine gun position, so when it's overrun, when they get there and start seeing what's happening and occupy the position and start fiddling with the gun, you can blast them with the Claymore. You can simply strap C4 into it and have it command detonated, right? And if this would be limited by, okay, if you're not too far away and you have maybe a fiber optic cable or even something a little bit more primitive like simple copper wiring attached to the cameras, then you could command detonate it. But if you have to be far away, you could simply booby trap it like the Viet Cong did. And furthermore, you could also have a prearranged call for fire. And once we vacate the position, once we know the Russians are there, we can drop mortar rounds on it, or artillery, or an airstrike, or a helicopter strike. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, if you have an automated defensive position occupying a high ground, this is something I've got to thank. At the time, he was Lieutenant Choi. He was the platoon commander of 4th Platoon, one of the platoons I was in. And he was a big fan of the reverse slope defense that the British used in the Falkland Islands. So you've got the high ground. And once you cross the high ground, they kind of think it's safe. And as they're going down, there's people dug in on the reverse slope shooting up at them. It's very ambushing. Now, I think automated machine guns would be ideal for a reverse slope defense because... See, when you have people in reverse slope defense, you have the assault force coming down at you and you're shooting up at them. But if they get past you, then you've been flanked and you've got to reorient your guns, and you kind of have nowhere to go. You would be pinned if you didn't have sufficient firepower. But one way you can do a reverse slope defense is you can have automated machine guns on the reverse slope and behind them some type of landmine, and then a little bit further away a heavy machine gun like a 50 cal that would actually strafe them as they came down, right, as they went over their ridge, and then they think they're safe. They get engaged by automated machine guns on the reverse slope, and then they're like, let's assault through. And these guns maybe couldn't necessarily swivel around, but maybe they could. And you pop onto the landmines and you're getting lit up by 50 cals, right? And for all we know, the 50 cals could be automated. You're really limited by your telemetry and your communication. You could have fiber optic cables, which are very easy to hide, and simple things like copper and radio transmission. Although, you've got to worry about counter electronics, and you've got to worry about the enemy potentially intercepting your messages. But I think a very thin, dug-in fiber optic cable would be very advantageous. On top of this, if you create a drone that is capable of shooting the equivalent of an AK or an M16 or an M4 or something like that, but because it's not a person shooting it, you don't need a pistol grip and a buttstock and everything. It could be just the firing mechanism in the barrel, and the way the drone aims is it simply points itself and flies in. You have the capacity to engage with small arms fire, and then you can give the drone a payload. For example, you can arm the drone with, let's say, 200 rounds of 5.56, and on the drone you have a landmine, maybe like a bouncing Betty type thing. The drone flies into the enemy territory and drops off mines, and then, engages the enemy in such a fashion that the enemy thinks it's being attacked. For example, not just from the air, it could simply land and fire off a few shots and attract enemy fire and attract enemy movement. Ideally, you'd want the enemy moving at you. Once the enemy starts moving, the drones drop off a couple landmines and book it. The enemy crosses the area with the landmine. They get engaged by the drones again, and then you can booby trap your drones. You can put a little C4. So if the enemy catches your drone and fondles it, you would know how to disarm it. They don't know your IED. They get blown up. And furthermore, for less weight. Instead of a payload of, let's say, instead of C4 or a self-destruct mechanism or a mine, you have the equivalent of a rifle, an automatic rifle, and a transponder. So when this thing is captured, it begins to transmit its location, in which case you can call for fire on it if the enemy captures it. And you could have maybe, some type of facial recognition software, so it would recognize, it might look for Russian rank insignia or something like that. So you could have, with software being the way it is, you could listen for Russian military commands, right? So this absolutely positively changes land warfare from now on. If the U.S. doesn't have the capacity to do the things that I'm talking about, and I think we do, we're just not letting on, our killbots are going to play a much more important role in the armed forces and global conflict. I mean, more so than just the drone attacks. You have to realize this war is different than the war in Afghanistan because it was a very asymmetrical war. The Taliban and the insurgents in Afghanistan and in the Middle East did not have anything near our technology. Even now, with captured equipment and Chinese equipment and whatever the U.S. left in Afghanistan, a lot of it is decades old or was technology created in the last century, near the middle of the last century, some of it. And they don't have the infrastructure to run it all. For example, if insurgents in the Mideast or Afghanistan captured a fleet of 20 F-16s, they might not have the fuel and the wherewithal and the radar system to effectively deploy them against us. And remember, the F-16, the concept was started in the 60s, and I think the first prototypes came out in the 70s. So we're not exactly talking about state-of-the-art here. Whereas the Ukrainians and Russians have, kind of the same technology level, and war looks very different when one side doesn't have complete air superiority and complete technological superiority, and both sides have night vision, both sides have bombers and helicopters and drones and things like that, and the Ukrainians are incredibly innovative in this battle. And I'm not saying this because I want more Russians to die. I believe the Ukrainians deserve their freedom, as does anybody else. I really wish in this planet we would stop trying to take things from each other, take land from each other. I know, I like history, I like studying history. I study the history of many empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, the Mongols, the British, the French, and I admire bravery, I admire innovativeness, I admire fighting spirit, but ultimately I know that there's a huge immorality behind warfare, behind conquest, behind occupation, and I want it to end. But the truth of the matter is you have to defend yourself. There's a moral and immoral way to defend yourself, and simply targeting civilians, abducting children, killing children, poisoning water supplies, all these things, they're immoral. War is not a moral thing. And if you choose to fight back, oftentimes you're just choosing between 10 different evils, and if you have a moral standard, you're trying to do the least evil thing, but you have to participate in evil. It is not a angelic choir, Edonic, paradise planet we live on, and maybe one day it could be, right? But yes, land warfare has changed. The Ukrainians are demonstrating that it absolutely, positively will change, and we must adapt to it. My mind races with the possibilities. I think one reason why I'm sort of really snapping into this is my absolute love of history of all ages, history of warfare, history of peace, history of weapons, history of technology, cultures, religion, And I can kind of recognize this is a keystone moment. All right. So to the Ukrainians, I hope you get your freedom. I hope when you do fight, you fight justly. You don't commit atrocities. I hope you treat your POWs better than yours are being treated. And I hope you emerge from this as survivors. You're losing a lot of your population, but so are the Russians. Again, in a perfect world, this would all end. Everybody would declare victory and put the weapons down and start talking, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. And so, therefore, robot machine guns.